Well, a very good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. So, I would like to make good a very major and grave omission from our cycle of lectures last semester on Western Armenian literature. And you will remember that we had included Revont Alishan, Father Revont Alishan, the Mkhitarist father, as one of our very earliest authors, who wrote both in ancient Armenian and in Western Armenian, although sometimes you cannot even tell the difference because the Western Armenian is a mixture between what we consider to be Western Armenian and ancient Armenian, or it's a very archaic form of Western Armenian. And then we went on to work on Bedros Turian, who is one of my favorite writers of all time. But there's someone between those two in the middle whom we omitted. And in fact, I thought of adding him retrospectively when we looked at the oeuvre of Serpuhi du Sap. And that's Mkrtič Péšikt'ašlean. He is a very key figure, and he actually taught Serpuhi du Sap when she was still Serpuhi Vahanyan. And there's a connection between the two of them. There's also a romantic connection between the two of them. And there's a beautiful touch because Serpuhi du Sap, whom we considered as a novelist and a feminist, actually was a well-trained pianist and musician, and she actually composed the music for one of her teachers, that is Mkrtič Péšikt'ašlean's poems. So there is that interesting connection as well. But his proper place is between Revont Alishan and Bedros Turian, I would say. Although, of course, Father Revont Alishan lived to have a long life, so he was still alive, whereas Mkrtič Péšikt'ašlean, as so many very gifted Armenian Constantinopolitan writers, died at an early age from consumption, from tuberculosis. So, what is his work? Well, nothing of his was published during his lifetime, but he was a poet and he was a playwright. So, in a sense, look, he is anticipating Bedros Turian, who also wrote plays, as you may remember. Now, his poems are called Odes d'Arer, and there are about 60 of them. 20 of them he wrote in Krapar, in ancient Armenian. 31 of them are in modernish Western Armenian, although, again, they're very archaic. And 9 of them, and those are very interesting, they are usually described as translations, but they are not just translations. They go beyond that. But remember that, as we saw in the case of Bedros Turian last semester, Constantinopolitan Armenians, such was the vibrancy and vitality of their culture that they were not at all afraid of deriving inspiration from Western literature, particularly French literature. And so we saw, for example, when Bedros Turian wrote Le Jag, the little lake, the little mere, that was inspired by Lac, by Lamartine. Of course, Lamartine poem is much longer, and it's not a translation at all. But we agreed that probably Bedros Turian's Le Jag could not have existed had not Lamartine not have written his poem before. But what became popular was translating Western poetry into Armenian, whether ancient Armenian or an archaic sort of Western Armenian. And in some cases, these translations became celebrated and famous and They are remembered to this day, whereas the original French is now obscure and even French people don't know it. The other thing that we find as another component of this very, very exciting cultural melting pot, which was late 19th century Constantinople, that Western composers wrote music for Armenian poems, and conversely, that Western melodies that already existed, composed by Western composers, were used by Armenians, and they became songs that became famous, one of which is the Armenian national anthem, Mer Hayrenik Azadangah. In fact, that's a bowdlerization. The original words are Mer Hayrenik Teshvarander. Mer Hayrenik Teshvarander. The music is from a ballet by Glazunov, but no one knows the music. It's now known as the Armenian national anthem. It happened the other way around as well. So, for example, there's a traditional Armenian melody associated with Zeytun, and we're going to talk about Zeytun now because he inspired Zeytun, and particularly the resistance put up by the denizens of Zeytun in 1862, when they were attacked by an Ottoman army that outnumbered them and outgunned them hugely, and yet they were able to put up resistance. It's a song associated with the Zeytun Siner, and it is da 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 dum pom 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 pirum pom pom parum pom pom di 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 dim di 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 da di da dum da dum pom pom pa di 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 dim, and in Armenian it's sung to the words Arev Yelav Zeytun Siner. But the piece is now also known as the theme for number 4, the procession of the Sardar, of the 4 Caucasian pieces by the Russian composer Ippolito Ivanov, who spent some of his career in Tiflis, now Tbilisi, present-day Georgia, which, however, was one of the 3 major centers of Armenian culture in the world, Tbilisi. After Constantinople and San Lazarovenis, Tbilisi, and I wouldn't say it was the 3rd, it was one of the 3 most important centers. And in the preface to the score, Ippolito Ivanov acknowledges that this is a melody sung by the Zeytun Siner. So he didn't compose it. He borrowed the melody, and he produced a magnificent orchestral piece that I've conducted many times in different places with considerable success. So these sort of interactions were happening. If you listen to the pre-recorded lecture that I prescribed to you last week from Library of Congress conference, where I physically went to Washington, I was invited to go there and to lecture, you will also know about the connection between the Venetian Italian composer Pietro Bianchini and Armenian poetry, because he said Revont Alishan's Pam porodan pyom popom popom pipom pipadadam, which for many, many decades was a sort of informal, unofficial Armenian national anthem. So that you will know as well. So these things were happening, and they were enriching Armenian culture, which was strong enough to be able to absorb these influences and arrive at a new synthesis and put an Armenian stamp on those things. You will find that at times of vitality, there have been exciting interactions with sister traditions and neighboring traditions, and at times of retrenchment and insecurity and cultural decline and decay, such as our own time, people are reluctant to acknowledge foreign elements, or they are closed to outside influences, or they wish to resist these influences. And those influences do not result in inspiration and something new, that is something unique. They may even result in impoverishment rather than enrichment. But anyway, these things are outside our scope. So let's return to Mkrtič Péšikt'ašlean. He has 9 translations, and one of them is extremely important, and we shall look at it in detail in a moment. He has left us 9 plays. Some of them are translations or international pieces, but some of them are his own original creations, and these are based on various events from Armenian history. None of his work was published in his lifetime, so what we have was published later in different compilations. He was born in Constantinople. He came from an Armenian Catholic family, as a lot of culturally active people did. Remember, they had the advantage of having close connections with the Mkrtič congregation. And remember, the Mkrtič fathers, apart from their monastery in Venice, which is still there, they had various schools in different places in Europe, including Eastern Europe, but also in France. So he was educated at such institutions, Mkrtič schools. He taught from an early age. It is said that he was in love with Serpuhi Vahanyan, who later became Serpuhi Dusap, but there were various social barriers of social class and the age gap, so it was, though not unrequited, it was a sort of unconsummated relationship. But when he was dying at the age of 40, Serpuhi would visit him at his bedside and read to him and help look after him. And I already mentioned she set one of his poems to music. She composed the melody. And that's a song called Tu zov chântres. Whom do you seek? From his cycle Mah Kachortvuin, which was inspired by the Zeytun uprising of 1862. Now, Zeytun, because of its geographical disposition, it was high on a mountain, and because they had mines from which the Zeytun Tsiner could obtain iron ore, and they could construct their own weapons, and they had ammunition, and they had a tradition whereby even children learned how to use guns, and even old people used guns. They had been sort of autonomous, and they did not pay taxes to the Ottoman coffers. They were technically under Hagia Sophia, so they paid a very light tax to the mosque, because Hagia Sophia, one of the greatest churches in the whole of Christendom, had become a mosque, of course. There had been various attempts from the end of the 18th century even, on the part of Central Ottoman government to subjugate the Zeytun Tsiner, and they hadn't succeeded. And in 1862 they made another such attempt. They demanded that the villagers of Zeytun pay a tax, going back many, many years, a sort of retrospective tax of I don't know how many million piasters, which there was no way the villagers could pay. And they attacked them using a huge force. And the villagers managed to resist, although, of course, though they succeeded in repelling the Ottoman army, it was a tremendous setback because they lost their autonomous status, and it was only a question of time. During the genocide, Zeytun was completely cultured. If you want an interesting sort of potted history, a sort of in a nutshell, history of Zeytun, I would recommend the book, the recent book that has won a prize, in fact, by Dr. Hernar Zeytlian Vattenpauw, The Missing Pages, which is the history of an Armenian medieval gospel manuscript illuminated by the famous medieval artist Toros Roslin. And the Zeytun Gospel was kept there, and she discusses the history of Zeytun and what happened to this manuscript, because during the genocide, some of the most beautiful illuminated pages were taken away. These were eventually stolen or sold, and they ended up in the, I think it's the Getty Museum. And there was a famous court case which lasted several years, the Armenian prelacy, Western prelacy of the United States, which is under the jurisdiction of the Catholicosate of the Great House of Cilicia in Entails, sued the museum. And eventually they decided to come to an agreement. So the Armenian Church donated those pages to the museum, insisting, and the museum had to agree, that they explain that this is Armenian, they explain the circumstances, and so that has been done. At the Getty Museum, those pages from the manuscript can be seen by many, many thousands of visitors, of course, but it is a bit of a shame that those pages are there in the United States, whereas the rest of the gospel manuscript is kept at the Madenataran. But you could argue that at the Walter Getty Museum, you have much better access because they have high quality images you can download, something that the Madenataran does not like doing. So you can find a compact history of the Zeytun uprising of 1862 and what happened before and what happened after in one of the chapters in this book. And my review of the volume is due to appear any day now in Clavibus Unitis, which is a Czech peer-reviewed online journal. Now, even during his lifetime, some of his poems, or odes, as they are referred to, were very, very popular. And they became very popular because they became songs. They were sung by people. And they continued to be sung long after Péšikt'ašlean passed away. The composers include Mkrtič Péšikt'ašlean, who is of course well known as the first Armenian composer of operas. His Arshak II is something that has been staged in the United States. It is often performed in Armenia as well. And he writes rather like Giuseppe Verdi. It's that sort of style. He wrote operettas as well, some of which were performed in Constantinople, some of which were in Turkish, such as Leblebici Horhor Agha, which later was translated into Armenian and was staged in Paris, in London, and more recently in Armenia, by my cousin, the actor and stage director Gérard Papazian. That's interesting because some of his melodies of Utidjian, who died in poverty in Smyrna, in Izmir, if I remember rightly, some of the melodies from his operettas or other things he composed became so popular that people were singing them everywhere in the Armenian diaspora without knowing who had composed it. Some people even thought it's a traditional song or a folk song. A melody, which is a movement from Leblebici Horhor Agha by Utidjian, later became arranged with new words, revolutionary words, known as Herik Vortiag Aiskan Darvar Darabank. Enough, my son, suffering of so many years. And it actually is an incitement for Armenians to take up their arms, and if they don't have arms, to use garden instruments like spades to kill, euphemistically, Kurds. Whenever Armenians wanted to write something against Turks, they would write Kurd, instead of Turk, to go round censorship rules. So this melody, which is the melody of the people who are selling nuts in the street, the leblebijis, dried chickpeas, dried and salted chickpeas. So a perfectly innocent song, metamorphosed into the revolutionary song, Herik vort yagai skandarva darabank, Herik tada ankut kürdin cerkningang, Tejev chuning voch sur voch tur voch nizag, Merpa hernel ganen rans shan sadag, Menkacherido mitsenk yevazat, Tarararati-da-da-da-da-da-da-dam, Tejev chuning voch sur voch tur voch nizag, Merpa hernel ganen rans shan sadag. So this is quite a revolutionary song. It is saying, though we don't have swords and spears, we can kill them using our spades. And so this melody became sung to completely different words. My late maternal grandmother used to sing this. I was taught this at school. And there is an interesting article by Archimandrite Komitas, written early in the 20th century, if my memory serves me, where he is criticizing a newly published Armenian songbook, saying that this is not Armenian, this is a sort of Kurdish or Turkish song, because in fact it was being sung to Turkish words as well, and that's how Komitas heard it. He had no idea that Utidjian had written it. So many of these things acquired an independent existence, and we're going to talk more about this. However, I'm digressing a little bit, although these digressions are, I trust, interesting to you. They're very, very significant if you're interested in the social history or the history and the cultural interactions of those times. But remember, this operetta of Utidjian, Leblebiji Horhoraga, Turks would attend. These things were played in the theaters in Constantinople. So Utidjian was one of the composers who set the poetry of Péšikt'ašlean. His pupil Serpuhi Vahanyan, later Serpuhi Dusab, and a very gifted but rather mysterious Armenian composer called Kaprien Yeranyan, who died even at an earlier age than Péšikt'ašlean. I think was 30-something. I know of him because Yeriaden Desyan, the great Armenian church musician and musicologist, worked with Yeranyan. And Yeranyan is now famous because there's a song of which he composed the melody, which is sung to this day, and virtually every civilized Armenian sings it. It's called Giligia, Cilicia. Yepor patsvin ternen huso, yemer yergren pachdatsemer, cheknach yergir mer armenio, yerpaile yur kavtsvi gore, Jepvor zidzarnir puintara, Jepvor zaren hakninderev, Tsangam desnel zimgiligya, Ashkar vorins jedurarev, Tsangam desnel zimgiligya, Ashkar vorins jedurarev. So the melody was written by Gabriel Yeranyan. And Gabriel Yeranyan also set the poetry of Mkrtič Péšikt'ašlean. So some of Péšikt'ašlean's work became very popular because of the fact that it was sung. It was sung popularly. And I would say the only other figure who is comparable in this respect is Kamar Katiba. Kamar Katiba, it's a pseudonym or a nom de plume for Raphael Badganyan, who was, of course, who is considered an Eastern Armenian poet, but in fact he came from a Constantinopolitan family. His grandfather, if I'm not mistaken, was born in Constantinople, was a musician and a poet, and it was a whole family of creative people. Kamar Katiba is well loved, and he wrote songs such as Himiel Renkjech Park, Himiel Mkrtič Péšikt'ašlean. So you can see that this is the beginning of a huge and very rich and highly significant creative wave. So we cannot leave out Mkrtič Péšikt'ašlean. And we're only now scratching the surface. So let's pass on to the next slide, unless there are any questions so far. None so far, so I can go on. Righty-ho, the next lecture. Now, I sang a moment ago a little bit of the song Giligia. And that is so iconic, and it is sung today in churches at the end of the Divine Liturgy, in some places even. And it illustrates so beautifully the phenomenon that I'm talking about, and it is closely related to the figure of Mkrtič Péšikt'ašlean that I'm going to talk to you about this for a while. Entails, the church musician and musicologist I've mentioned many times in the past, he's very, very important, and I'm a great admirer of his. He also died prematurely at the age of 47, but that's because he was one of the first victims of censorship by the Sultan Abdul Hamid. He died in 1881, and it was because of a songbook, a Yerkaran, he published in 1880, which was full of patriotic songs which mentioned the name Armenia, Hayastan, which was forbidden. And in fact, when he was imprisoned, and he died in prison or in the prison hospital, he got typhoid fever in hospital, which is a very great tragedy. Not just for himself and his family, but for the Armenian nation and for Armenian church music in general. But his family was so terrified that this songbook is now so rare. There are very few copies of it in the world, because his family burned all the copies they could find after he was imprisoned, out of fear. So, in this songbook, you find, amongst other things, 2 Armenian songs, one next to the other, and they are both considered to be translations from a French poem. The first one was done by Mkrtič Péšikt'ašlean, and it is called Hayastan, Armenia. The second one was done by a medical doctor called Nahabed Rusinyan, and it's called Giligia. For the information I'm going to give you now, I have benefited greatly from an article by another doctor, a dentist, but a very fine philologist who is happily still with us, called Dr. Haig Utidjian, who lives in Beirut. An article called Tarkmanutene Tebian Mahutyun, From Translation to Immortality, published in the journal Gamar in 2007. So, what happened? So basically in 1836, a French employee who was an amateur musician and an amateur poet composed a poem called Normandy in French, and he composed the melody for it as well. This song, which was composed in 1836, inspired Mkrtič Péšikt'ašlean, who translated it into ancient Armenian. Some years later, Nahabed Rusinian produced his own version, again from the French. And I would first like to introduce you to the French version. So I shall do that now. Please protest if for some reason you can't hear this. I'm going to start it now.
Renaître à l'espérance, et que l'hiver fuit loin de nous, sous le beau ciel de notre France, quand le soleil revient plus doux, quand la nature est reverdie, quand l'hirondelle est de retour. À revoir ma Normandie, c'est le pays qui m'a donné le jour. J'ai vu les champs de l'Helvétie, et ces chalets, et ces glaciers, j'ai vu le ciel de l'Italie, et Venise et ses gondoliers, en saluant chaque patrie, je me disais, aucun séjour n'est plus beau que ma Normandie. C'est le pays qui m'a donné le jour. Il est un âge dans la vie où chaque rêve doit où l'âme recueillie a besoin de se souvenir lorsque ma muse refroidie aura fini ses chants d'amour. J'irai revoir ma Normandie, c'est le pays m'a donné.
So, this is the French song. We can have a look at it here. And what does the translation say? Quand tout renaît à l'espérance et que l'hiver fuit loin de nous, sous le beau ciel de notre France, quand le soleil revient plus doux, and so on and so forth. You get you get a sense of the sound of it. So, when everything is reborn in hope and winter flees far from us, under the beautiful sky of our France, when the sun returns gentler, when nature has turned green again, when the swallow has returned, I like to see again my Normandy. It's the country where I was born. We can see what Mkrtič Péšikt'ašlean did with this on the right-hand side. Minchter husov chajda pnutiun, whilst with hope takes delight nature, head tarnashunch tsemerainuin, after winter with its bitter breath. So you see, it's going beyond merely translating the French. Keradzizar tarna karun. Spring returns full of beauty and joy, beauty and laughter, beauty and smiles. Minch pur I pur petin zargung, whilst fragrantly blossom the flowers. Yevjervoren noreg zidzrung, and swallows that have newly come, make their bird-like noise. Ikez yestarts arnem hainjam, ov tsangalit im hayastan. At that time I shall make my return, O my desirable Armenia. So, instead of de notre France, we have Kavarn im Haireni, which means my paternal, my home district or region. And instead of Normandy, we have Hayastan. It continues in the same way. So it has been skillfully adapted. In the second stanza, the poet is saying, I have seen the beautiful fields of Switzerland and Italy and Venice and its gondoliers. I think the Venice bit isn't to be found in the translation, but we have a reference to the Swiss fields and joyous grasslands and lawns and the Italian sky and so on. And yet the poet still is missing the khansarur, which literally means the swaddling clothes, the piece of cloth with which you wrap a newly born baby. Oh, Armenia. He wants to return to Armenia. And for the final stanza, the poet, that is the French poet, is saying, there comes a time in life where every dream comes to an end, and his chilled, very cold, rendered very cold muse returns to the past, and he wants to return to Normandy. Now, here, Péšikt'ašlean is more explicit, and he says, in fact, Zninch idzotset arnum hainjam, ov tsangalit im hayastan. So when he reaches that final time in life when he stops dreaming, he stops hoping, he wishes at that time to be buried in Armenia, as ninch idzotset arnum. He wants to sleep in the breast of the land. So he wishes to be interred, he wishes to be buried there. So it's very beautifully written, and you could argue, the literary critic and writer Haig Utidjian was merciless in his criticism of this piece by Mkrtič Péšikt'ašlean, saying it is a pile of words, guidme parer, or something of that sort. I think this is very unfair. This is rather beautiful. I like it. According to the research of Dr. Yeriayan, this would have been sung to the French melody. Yadam pipim 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 pipa da di da dam da di da dam. I haven't tried how to be Minster Husov Haida Plutjun et Tarnashun Chtsemer. Maybe something like that. I'm just making things up as I go along. I haven't thought this out. Maybe I should take some music paper and look at how one could best fit the words to this melody. But the thing is, this was not set to music, as far as we know, by Gabriel Iranian, the mysterious and tragic Armenian composer who set the alternative translation of the French words, which was done by Dr. Nahabed Roussinian. And this is another page from the Dendesian songbook. And this is what every Armenian knows. And look, it also is a translation of the French, but it has, instead of Hayastan, it says Giligia. Maybe it says Giligia because Hayastan would have been forbidden. Or maybe it says Giligia because apparently at that time many Armenians were hoping that Cilicia may become an independent country. There was a substantial Armenian population, and many rich Armenians were buying land there in this hope. And remember, it became a French protectorate. Unfortunately, the French betrayed the Armenians later, and the Armenian Legion, which fought for the French, was disbanded, and that was a great tragedy. There may be other reasons, but let's look at this alternative translation. Oh gosh, there's a mistake here. I've connected the wrong... okay, just let me see. Okay, so this is what we need at the end of this slide. Sorry about that. So this is incorrect. And this is what is required. That's better. Okay. And I'll enlarge it. Okay. And this is the well-known, well-loved Jeb vor patsvinternern huso jemer jergren pachdatzemer, which is also a translation of the French. When the doors of hope open and winter escapes from our country, and sous le beau ciel de notre France, under the beautiful sky of our France, has become this exquisite land of ours, Armenia. When the swallow returns to its nest, when the trees dress in leaves, I desire to see my Cilicia, the world that gave the sun to me, which means that's where I first saw the sun, that is where I was born. Instead, so since we are dealing with the theme of Cilicia, Helvetia, l'Helvétie, or Switzerland, has become Syria. De Sitasteren Syrio, I saw the fields, I have seen the fields of Syria. Liaren Lipanan, Mount Lebanon, Yevur Mairer, and its cedars. Mair means mother, but it also means Mairizar, which is cedar, the cedars of Lebanon. I saw the land of Italy, Venice and its gondolas. So, Venise, esse gondolier, has been rendered here, whereas in the Péšikt'ašlean version it is not there at all. Yev vochmek vaire artarev keretsig kanzim giligia. Oh, by the way, let's not forget, Gerzineman chik mer Gibra. In this version it's Gibra, the version I know is Gibria. It's the genitive of Gibros. And this, by the way, unlike the Péšikt'ašlean translation, which is explicitly into ancient Armenian, this is supposed to be into modern Armenian, Western Armenian, but it is so archaic that it has so many morphological features that are ancient Armenian. But it's not ancient Armenian, not quite. So there's no island such as our Cyprus. By the way, ladies and gentlemen, that's where I was born, as you may know. You see, Nahabed Rusinian was a doctor at the court of the Sultan or the governor, and he was part of a delegation to the Lebanon, and he took some time off to visit Cilicia because he wanted to see it. And he also visited Cyprus, and he was absolutely bowled over by those places. But also, as we said, Cilicia had a special place in the affection of Armenians. After all, it was not all that long ago when there was the last Armenian kingdom in Cilicia that ended in 1375. And there was still the Catholicosal throne of the great house of Cilicia. It was in Sis, where it remained until, I think, 1923, when it moved. I think they first went to Damascus, then to the Lebanon, and they settled down in Entails, where they still are, and where I have been invited to teach in May this year, God willing. So the last stanza, Il est un âge dans la vie où chaque rêve doit finir. There's an age, there's a stage in life where every dream must finish, must end. Հասակ մգա մեր գենած մեջ, ուր ամենայն իրց գավարդի. By the way, in modern Western Armenian, hasag usually means height. If I say hasagat inche, you can tell me it's 1 meter and 80 centimeters. But in older usage, hasag can mean age. We do say garja hasag, someone who is short in stature, or partra hasag. But hasag here means age, and that's the traditional usage of the word. Ur amenain irts gavardi, where every yearning ends. And horjam kanaris in Tsardana, when my lyre becomes cold, siruin dalov verchin parev, giving its final salutation to love. Yertam nanchel him giligia. I'm going to sleep in my Cilicia, the world that gave me the sun. And of course, we can ask the question, as Dr. Armenag Yeryayan has tried to do in his article, Why is it that the Péšikt'ašlean version now is forgotten, whereas everyone sings the Rusinyan version? I don't think you can say one is better, the other one is less good. They're both very, very fine. Well, Utidjian says that the Rusinyan one, even though it's almost ancient Armenian, it's more easily comprehensible to people who don't know ancient Armenian. That may be one factor. That the version by Rusinyan is more explicitly allegorical when it talks about Cilicia and when it refers to the gates of hope opening. Clearly, in the minds of Armenians at the time, singing about hope, about the swallow returning to its old nest. Clearly, this had to do with Armenian national aspirations for freedom, for independence. The melody by Gabriel Yeranyan, which is still sung, and there are innumerable arrangements and harmonizations. The earliest I know was by Christopor Garamurza, and the most recent one I know was done by my own late teacher, Archbishop Zareas Navorian of blessed memory. And now, in churches within the jurisdiction of the Catholicosate of the Great House of Cilicia, at the end of the Divine Liturgy, at the end of the Badarak, they sing, Jeb vor patsvin ternern huso, jemer jergren pachtatsemer. So this melody was more appealing to Armenians than the French melody with which the Péšikt'ašlean translation may have been associated. Although I've tried, and I reckon that you can fairly easily sing the Péšikt'ašlean version to the Yeranyan melody as well. So I am not sure which year Péšikt'ašlean produced his version in, nor are we absolutely certain about the year of the Utidjian version, of the Rusinyan version, but Utidjian considers 1860 to be the most likely year. And 3 or 4 years later, Gabriel Yeranyan himself died, so that gives us a sort of upper bound. So here are now, once again, the two versions next to each other. And both these people did, they both were very, very clear about the fact that what they were doing was translating the French. They did not pretend that these were entirely original poems. But they both did more than translate, and they wrote, in effect, Armenian poetry of value and significance, and which was a tremendous inspiration. Both these inspired several generations. And again, we can compare them directly one against the other. The Péšikt'ašlean version, Minchter husov chayda penutjun, Hed tarnashunch tsemerainun, Yevi kavarnim hayreni keradzidzar tarna karun, as opposed to the Rusinyan, Yerb vor patsvin ternern huso, Yevmer yergren pachtatsemer, Cheknar yergires meres armenio. By the way, the sung version usually does away with the archaic s suffix. Perhaps it's more awkward to sing. Yerpaile yurkachtstrigorer. And for the second half of the first stanza, let us first return to the Péšikt'ašlean version on the left. Mich puri pur petin zargung, yev jervoren noreg dzidzrung, ikez yes tartarnem hainjam ov tsangalitim hayastan. And Rusinyan has երբ որ ձիձարն իփույն դառնա, երբ որ ծառերն հագնին դերև, ցանգամ դեսնել զիմ գիլիգիա աշխարհ, որ ինձ յետուր արև. So that's one item by Péšikt'ašlean. Now, before I proceed to other things by Péšikt'ašlean, and we look at more of his poems and interactions that these poems experienced within their careers over the decades, I should like us to pause the recording, and I'd like to ask if there are any questions so far. So may we pause the recording, please? Sorry. Did you say something?
Yes, I'm starting recording now.
Okay. Right. It is a pity that we didn't record our little discussion with those present at this session. That's Marek and Inga, because a lot of interesting ideas emerged in this three-way interaction. We were thinking about the differences between the Armenian experience and the French experience as a way of accounting for the fact that there's a somewhat different spirit in the case of both these Armenian versions, no matter what their own internal differences might be. And the fact that, spring is so clearly an allegory, especially in the Rusinyan version. The idea of returning to the homeland and the idea of Hayastan, Armenia, a forbidden word, in fact, and something that has very much been an abstract concept for diasporan Armenians until very recently, and maybe even now to a certain extent. One thinks of a very spiritual Armenia as a sort of concept, as a sort of ideal, almost like sort of Upper Jerusalem, something of that sort. Whereas in fact, a Frenchman, even in those times, would have been able to sit on a coach or a train or something and go from Paris to Normandy if they felt like going to Normandy. So Normandy was much more accessible, much more reachable, and much more tangible than Hayastan. And Giligia was maybe tantalizingly something more in between, because Nahabed Rusinyan actually went and saw Giligia, and he was so bowled over by it. So Giligia was there, but it also symbolized an independent future Armenia, as some people were beginning to hope at that time, which indeed it came close to becoming, because it was a French mandate and the Armenian Legion was involved as well, until of course the French pulled the rug from under the feet of the Armenians by having an agreement with Atatürk, and that was a catastrophe and a great tragedy when it happened. As far as Giligia is concerned, it was interesting that Inga was very surprised, as I was some years ago when I first heard that it's supposed to be a translation of something French, that she knows Giligia and sings it and knows it by heart, as do very many of us, but without knowing that it originated in something French. It originated from something French. But of course we saw that both these Armenian versions go beyond, qualitatively, they go beyond the original French charming little song, although even that French song must have been powerful enough. It became the national anthem of Jersey, which is one of the Channel Islands, and where I had the honor of conducting a concert some years ago, by the way. And because it talks about Normandy, the islanders eventually decided they want a different anthem, and I think as recently as in 2007, they decided to change it, and they had a sort of competition, and they chose something else. And of course, in Normandy, apparently it is still known and might be sung. At that YouTube video where there's that lovely, surely historic recording that we heard a few minutes ago, people wrote comments, and there were various elderly people saying, my grandmother used to sing this and that sort of thing. And the other thing that we started talking about is possible commonalities and contrasts with the Czech experience, who, interestingly enough, at about the same time were experiencing, let us say, a similar cultural and linguistic revival, and perhaps similarly entertaining hopes of self-determination and independence, although Marek was saying that there are some significant differences, that Prague remained a Bohemian cultural center and was still accessible, and maybe there remained a sufficient concentration of ethnically Czech persons in the heart of Bohemia and also in Moravia, whereas the Armenian situation was different. It was mentioned that around Alexandropol there was a high concentration of Armenians, and Tbilisi as well, but that's the Caucasus. But within the Ottoman Empire, there was Constantinople, where I believe that the combined Armenian and Greek populations outnumbered the Turkish population, and there was the area around Lake Van, which was the center of gravity of the Armenian population of the Ottoman Empire, and that was one place where the Armenians had a certain self-confidence accruing from their own knowledge and sensation of being in the majority. But everywhere else, Armenians within the Ottoman Empire had by now constituted minorities. So the concept of a coherent Armenian homeland, Hayastan, was in some ways something, it had, there was something rather dreamlike about it. Marek, I'd like you to say what you think about this, please.
Yes, there are so many related topics to this age of national questions, maybe one could say in the 19th century, because this is that idea of dreaming about independence and self-determination and territoriality and community of people deciding their own fate on certain territory with the institution of modern status. So those are very actually modern features. It's both a revival and invention of some traditions, but there is this, I think there's this blind spot that ethnically mixed territories, like for example, Kingdom of Bohemia was 2/4 of the population. The heartland was Czech, but there were 1/3 of the population was German. So the self-determination on this territory for Czechs meant a loss of their aspirations for self-determination for Germans, and endless quarrels about history. And actually this was the result by ethnic cleansing about after 1945. So those dreams really are coming into fruition, and conflict and violent disappearing of whole populations, I think.
However, I think of Gde domov můj, and that was written and composed whilst there was no Czechoslovakia, long before then. And again, there is this idealization of the beauty and the nature and the meadows and the valleys and the rivers and the waters, which represent something spiritual, or Čechy krásné, Čechy mé, tam paparararidi. There are these things. So there are similar sentiments to what the Armenians are experiencing up to a certain point, aren't
I think
there?
this is maybe Czech national anthem is
Kde domov můj? Where is my home?
yes, it's similar to Normandy, the song, because
It's more closer to the French piece, Normandy, than to the Armenian Galicia, you would say.
Because it actually glorifies the beauty of the land. Most of who are singing it, they are living on the land.
On the land already.
There are some of them are abroad. Yeah, there were such times where people couldn't come home and sung this song abroad. But I think the Armenian version is closely connected to Bolis or Constantinople. So it's which is a city that is kind of
cosmopolitan and
yes, and it's away from Yergir.
yeah.
It's not really diaspora, but it's not really Yergir.
Yes, Constantinople is a very special category, isn't it? Because it is well outside the bounds of historical Armenia, but the major center of Armenian culture, which has its own ways of idealizing Armenia. And my friend and colleague, Dr. Vasken Tavitian, who is a Gulbenkian fellow at Oxford at the moment, he specializes in visual art, and he has been studying paintings made by Armenian Constantinopolitan painters in the, at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th, who, at a time when there was censorship and they could not write about such things, they would create those really wistful paintings of a porter from Van, who had arrived in Constantinople, an old man dressed in rags, sitting on the floor. He's an expatriate, he's a Bantucht, he has nothing, he has been suffering, he has come to Constantinople to try and earn a living and maybe help his family, or because he has nothing to eat because of the persecution and the punitively high taxes and the despoilment of the land and of the people, who in any case were more or less beyond the centralized authority of Constantinople in the traditional Armenian millets, and who are suffering very greatly. And so, in a sense, it's representing the pain of the Armenian experience in their traditional lands, viewed from a Constantinopolitan perspective. And of course, we know that well-to-do Constantinopolitans were by no means united in their desire to help those poor people coming from the historical Armenian lands to Constantinople. Many considered them to be a nuisance, but some wanted to help them. Some also maybe romanticized them. So there's this whole spectrum of different reactions, different thoughts, but studying those paintings is actually a very, very interesting thing, and Vasken has been doing some excellent work on this. But it shows the peculiar experience of viewing these places from a Constantinopolitan perspective. And we also have something about this problem in Ormanian's memoirs, Haig Utidjian, which my father and I have translated into English, Ormanian was against people from Armenians from the provinces being encouraged to come to Constantinople. But it wasn't because Ormanian was against those poor Armenians, but he felt that if there's going to be any chance of the Armenians being able to achieve something on their historic lands, then those historic lands should not be depopulated of their Armenian population, that there should remain as many Armenians as possible around Van and the Lake of Van. So there are all sorts of considerations there. There is one other thing I should like to add. It goes back to the beginning of today's session. You both watched last week my lecture for the Library of Congress, recorded in Washington 3 or 4 years ago now, on Bianchini and the Ode for the Patriarch, which he transcribed and harmonized and arranged, but also the fact that Bianchini had said Pam Porodan by Revont-Alishan. But the point that I would like to add now is, when I was saying about an hour ago that these connections went in both directions, you will recall that I ended that lecture with an intriguing suggestion, which is very difficult to prove, and it might not be true. It's only a suggestion, and it might be a fancy of mine, but it doesn't seem unreasonable, let's put it that way, that Bianchini himself, as a composer in the Western tradition, was influenced by that Armenian ode, sacred ode, and the motif metamorphosed into his Symphonia of 1862, the theme So, these things go in both directions. You find Western melodies being used by Armenians, Western composers composing melodies to Armenian words. All sorts of interesting things were happening. It was a sort of crucible from which wonderful things emerged. Not everything that emerged was of high quality, but of course there has been a process of filtration, and we, generally speaking, tend to receive things that those who came before us and their fathers and mothers before them and theirs before them have liked. Otherwise, things tend to be lost and forgotten. Oh, and the other thing that tends to happen is things tend to get transformed over time. So you find that Pam Porodan, or even a melody that is associated with a poem by Péšikt'ašlean, and other such things, get changed. The rough edges get rounded, and in the case of Pam Porodan, for example, the piece became more like a march over time. Things like Ov Medzats Kanch to Lezu, the melody also was modified, so that if you find the earliest publications where these appear, typically from the 1860s, to my knowledge, there may be something earlier, I haven't seen it or heard of it, you'd be surprised, because they are different to the versions that people like me learned at school, in the late 1970s. So things tend to be massaged into slightly different forms to serve the needs and to meet the tastes and aesthetics of the communities through which these things are transmitted. And that's quite an interesting thing, the way in which that happens. So, if you agree, we can now proceed to our next example, having done sufficient talking about Giligia and Hayastan. I would like to mention an Italian composer, since we talked about Bianchini very briefly. Bianchini has been covered to some extent in that Library of Congress lecture, to which I would refer any viewers who may be interested. And also I have an almost ready monograph on Bianchini and the Mkritarists, and that has a chapter about Pamporodan and its own evolution. But there's another composer who is associated with Armenian music in this period and Constantinople, also very little known now, and it's Gaetano Ferdinando Foschini. You can find, the fullest information I've been able to find on him is in the Treccani Biographical Dictionary. You've got a link up there. It's interesting that he did spend some time in Constantinople, but it is possible that he and Péšikt'ašlean got to know each other personally when Péšikt'ašlean was a student in Europe, particularly Italy. If you look at YouTube, you can find a very fine fugue for organ on the theme of Bach, B-A-C-H, da, da, di, dum, B flat, A, C, B natural, that is still played to this day. And his Armenian settings became so popular that, in a way that is comparable to Pamporodan by Bianchini, they sort of entered into an almost collective Armenian consciousness, and people sang these things without even knowing who had composed the melody. But a lot of people made arrangements, and soon people forgot who had composed it, and they assumed that one or other of the various people who had made the arrangements or harmonizations or choral versions or whatever had also composed the melody, even though that is not the case. And so let us see, well, before we look at the Foschini example, let us look at the melody that may have been composed, because I have found two mutually related but not identical melodies to this poem by Mkrtič Péšikt'ašlean, and we know that a melody, or perhaps the melody, was composed by his pupil Serpuhi Vahanyan, later Serpuhi Usap. And we shall look at the words, they are to do with Zeytun. This is the earliest version I found, which isn't very early at all. I'm most grateful to the musicologist Haig Utidjian, who lives and works in Egypt, where the musicologist Ashod Badmakarian spent some years. He was an Iranian Armenian, Persian Armenian, but he spent many years in Egypt, where in the 1940s he published 3 volumes of Armenian songs with a musical notation. Sometimes his musical attributions are not accurate because he didn't have access to old sources, Constantinopolitan sources and things like that. Sometimes he did, sometimes he didn't. And even melodies from Armen Dikranyan's Anush opera that he wrote from memory or on the basis of what people around him were singing through a sort of oral tradition. But these were already somewhat different to the original score composed by Armen Dikranyan in the case of the Anush opera melodies. So this may have been transcribed from memory. I haven't found any other written source that goes earlier. And the song is Tu zovchentres. Whom do you seek? Who are you looking for? And it's part of a cycle called Mkrtič, death of the heroic son, which explicitly refers to the resistance of the Zeytun Tziner. Tu zovchentres, Mairim Anush, whom dost thou seek, O mother mine sweet? Yeg, mitogar, modetsirhos, come, tremble not, approach hither. Anlats achok tidezortit. Watch over your son with eyes that do not weep, that are devoid of tears. U jurverkern arunahos, and his hemorrhaging wounds. Krdats mairer torlan utun urachlurer dar izeytun. Here, Krdats is, I'm sure, a euphemism for Turkats, because in other places I found Turkats. So, may the mothers of Kurds or Turks, may Turkish mothers weep, and you bear good news to Zeytun. Pretty explosive stuff, this. This would have been especially moving. These events were very, very fresh. A lot of Zeytunsis were killed. It was a very unequal battle. They did succeed in repelling this particular onslaught, but it was clear that in the longer term they don't have much of a chance. And as I said, it's explosive because, look, the last stanza has Sagan Mairim Naechorstin Zarun Rusht Sa Kurderendes Hazarnerov Pervatskedin. Look at all those Kurdish bodies spread in their thousands on the ground. And they meant Turkish, not Kurdish. Gerav Zanong Surenmer, our sword caused them to perish. Literally, our sword ate them, our sword consumed them. Utun urach lurerdar izeytun. The melody is something like Tu zovchentres mairim anush yegnitogar modetsirhos anlatsachok tidezortit uyur verken arunahos Turkats mairer torlanutun urach lurer dar izeytun urach lurer dar izeytun. I'm sight-reading this because I only received a PDF of the songbook very kindly from Haig Utidjian, who was generous enough to share it with me. But a lovely little melody. And in the score, it says Turkats Mairer, not Krdats Mairer. So this is one example of a poem by Péšikt'ašlean that existed as a song. And now I should like us to look at another example. And this was a short-lived musical journal published by Gabriel Yeranian, whom I refer to as the very talented but rather mysterious Constantinopolitan musician, composer and church musician who died very early and who collaborated for a while with Haig Utidjian. and the composer Mkrtič Péšikt'ašlean. Here it's written Péšikt'ašlean. You come across both spellings. It was published in 1861 and 1862. This is the second 6-month cycle. 1862, the May the 30th issue, number 2. The journal was called Kanar Haig Armenian Literature. And this is my source, the earliest source for all sorts of things, but 2 more songs, settings of poems by Mkrtič Péšikt'ašlean. And it's Karun. It means spring, and I am trying to correct this. There was a gap somewhere where it ought not to be. See, I got rid of the sign I need here. That's better. Rightio. I think that did the trick. Sorry about that little distraction. And these scans of Kanar were very kindly made available by Mr. Minasyan via Mr. Haig Utidjian. I'm most grateful to both these gentlemen, and I've started looking at these again very recently. Now, I had assumed that the melody was actually set by Gabriel Yeranyan, but I'm assured by Haig Utidjian, who is the leading world expert in those things, and especially on Péšikt'ašlean, that in fact it was composed by Péšikt'ašlean, not by Yeranyan, this particular song. But in this journal, it is attributed to Hantesi. It is attributed to the journal, so presumably to the editors of the journal. Whereas here and there, particular songs are attributed in this journal to Péšikt'ašlean or to Yeranyan, but in this case, neither of them is named. And I came to hear this melody. This is a remarkable example of the way in which these things tend to travel and go around and be transmitted over decades and centuries and appear in the most unexpected form. About 10 years ago, the late editor of Early Music Review, it's Early Music Review and not Early Music Recordings. There's another error here that I should like quickly to correct, if I may. It's Early Music Review. The editor wrote to me saying, we wish to review this CD called L'Esprit d'Arménie, and you have been recommended to us as the specialist who would be able to do this well. It's a CD by Jordi Savall, who is a very well-known early music specialist. I think Savall is double L. I'm terribly sorry. I think I've got another mistake. Okay, I've corrected that as well now. And we can't offer you a fee, but you get to keep the CD. Would you write a review for us? And I said yes. And so I found that without any words being sung, it was various Armenian songs from different eras that were being recreated by Jordi Savall's musicians in collaboration with 2 or 3 Armenian musicians, one of them playing the duduk and that kind of thing. Jordi Savall is such a gifted musician, and his colleagues are so very musicianly, that the end result was very moving and musical. But the musicological underpinnings were very dubious because they had relied on Soviet era and post-Soviet musicology, which leaves a good deal to be desired sometimes, let us put it that way. So various things that they assumed were traditional had been composed by particular people. In this case, I thought it might be Yeranian. It turns out it is Utidjian. And Utidjian is a classical composer. But it was assumed to be a traditional Armenian melody. And they sort of improvised around it and played it. And the result is very musical. And a lot of these things, some of the folk melodies transcribed by Komitas, they're beautiful, simple songs that, you know, a villager would sing or a peasant girl would sing when she was doing a bit of weaving, or a peasant when he was cultivating the fields. But here they were being played very slowly, very soulfully, and so on. And the result musically was very beautiful. But I had the feeling that Jordi Savall and his colleagues thought that they were doing maybe something a little different to what they were doing. And their sources might have been maybe a little bit more faithful. You can find my review in Esprit d'Arménie. For a while I found that if you looked at the CD and tried to order it from Amazon, immediately they quote from my review of it, because my ultimate view was that it was a very beautiful CD, and musically it was very well done. But it was, and there were no words, but it was a poem by Péšikt'ašlean, which Utidjian set. And this emerged in 2011 or 2012 as a CD by a well-known early music group. I think they're based in Spain, Jordi Savall. And I will first play you the instrumental melody in the arrangement by Savall and his colleagues. So I hope that Utidjian doesn't mind too much that his song has been transformed in this quasi-medieval way, not perhaps medieval, but be that as it may. But it shows you how a melody has re-emerged in this way. This was quite well loved in the 19th century as a song with words by Mkrtič Péšikt'ašlean, and it's now been largely forgotten. I didn't know this melody until I received the CD 10 years ago, and I heard it. I wanted to know what it was. I asked around, and my cousin, the stage director and actor and Utidjian scholar and collaborator of Haig Utidjian, Girard Papazian, referred me to Yeranyan and his circle, Yeranyan Utidjian, and most recently Haig Utidjian has kindly informed me definitively that it is by Utidjian. And let us look at this 1862 publication where it appears, and we can look at the words. Here, looking at the score, we can see that the way they're playing it is, here it seems to have a piano accompaniment. It's Wohin shanu shevin shpesov aravodut spečesovig cavkan svrakur kuralov Mazerun gusic papig, Paitz Czesovig im haireniac, Cânan sir sardesipac, Paitz Czesovig im haireniac, Cânan sir sardesipac, Uinchahu Sardakin, and so on and so forth. Now, let us look at the words. Vo, inch anush Եվ ինչպես զով արավոդուց պչես հովիկ, ձաղգանց վրա կուրկուրալով եւ մազերուն գուսին պապկիկ. Oh, how sweet and how cool you breathe in the morning, breeze, caressing or looking after the flowers, and the hair of the gentle virgin, the gentle girl. But you are not the breeze of my motherland. Go away, pass away from my heart. Second stanza. Voh, inch աղու եւ սրդակին ծառոց մեջ են երկես թրջնիկ, սիրո ժամերն իհանդարին զմայլեցան իքոցայնիկ, բայց չես թրջնիկ իմ հայրենյաց, կնա երկես սրդեսիպած. In the second stanza, the poet, Mkrtič Péšikt'ašlean, is saying, oh, how sweet and heartfelt is the way in which you're singing within the trees. O little bird, in the forest, in the hours of love, or the hours of love in the forest, admired your little voice. But you are not the little bird of my fatherland. Go away from my heart. Sing somewhere away from my heart. The third stanza refers to the stream, where once again we have a mirror in which someone is gazing, rather reminiscent of the little mere, the little lake of Bedrosturian that we looked at last semester. Ինչու ապշած լջագ ուչեն խայդար կոայլյագ Mite heilvuit mech anskav keruim anaetzar, where the poet is asking the little lake why it is so troubled or surprised, and its little waves, its wavelets are not taking delight. Could it be that in distress, in the mirror that is formed by this little lake, a beautiful girl may have gazed? So here we have Ku hailvuit mech anabag nain zirenk vartnu achchig. So the third stanza is being addressed to the little stream, to the Vadag. And the poet says, in your mirror, in your uncorrupted, in your clear and pure mirror, look at themselves, the rose and the girl. So this stream is a marvelous place, and yet you are not the stream of my motherland. Go away and flow away from my heart. And finally, the fourth stanza says this: Tebet terchnigen uhoven hayots averagats terchin vera. Tebet berdor vdagen hayots nojineru mech gesora. Noka harachken haireniats. Noka chertan sirdes ipats. So, what is happening now? Well, the poet is now specifically thinking of a little bird and a breeze that fly and flow over the ruins of the Armenians. And though the stream of the Armenians the water is troubled and is no longer transparent, and the stream is crawling in the middle of cypress trees, noji. These are the sighs of the fatherland. Let those not depart from his heart. So, this little poem, touching little poem, appealed to Utidjian. You can see here, it says Yeranag Hantesin, melody of the periodical. So it is not clear who wrote it, presumably one of the editors. Due to independent reasons, Haig Utidjian has established that it is indeed Utidjian. I had previously suspected it might be Iranian. But this was sung in its day and enjoyed. And it wasn't entirely forgotten, but it is now very little known. And relatively recently, Jordi Savall played it with his musicians, as you heard. So, we can pause the recording if you have any questions. Any questions or reactions? No? So we can now look at our next example.
I paused the recording.
You paused it?
No.
No, don't pause it because there are no questions, or pause it if you have a question.
Yeah, okay.
Do you have a question?
We can continue.
We can continue, okay. So, this is from another issue of Kanar Haygagan, the Armenian lyre. And here we are. Okay. That's better. Very sorry both to you and to other members of the class who will see this later in its recorded form, not to mention any viewers of YouTube if we put it there, for the fact that I keep making corrections on my slides as we proceed, but these are sources that I acquired 2 or 3 days ago, and I prepared the slides earlier today. So each time I teach or I lecture, I try to make little improvements or corrections. Now, this is another thing that was a very recent discovery. My good friend, the Reverend Dr. Archdeacon George Giragos Lelegian, very kindly sent me a YouTube presentation, a wonderful YouTube presentation made by a gentleman called Harut Arakelian, who is a passionate enthusiast for early Armenian recordings of songs made during the turn of the century, end of the 19th century even. There may be some things at the beginning of the 20th century. And he gave a beautifully illustrated talk where for the very first time I heard the melody of another song, which in old songbooks that have only words and no music, I've found it. So I've read the words many times without knowing the music ever. And it's a poem, again, by Mkrtič Péšikt'ašlean. And it praises brotherhood. And the title is Yeghbaer Yemk Menk. In more modern publications, you find Yeghbaer Yenk Menk. So the archaic form that you find in ancient Armenian of Yemk has become Yenk, which is modern Western Armenian. And it starts with the words Ipur Tsainitz. And it is similar in structure. It is referring to various wonderful things. Again, the affectionate songs that are flying from the fingers of the most beautiful virgin playing a gentle lyre. Even something like that. Thousands of voices of the most beautiful nature, none of these things have such a lovely voice as the name brother. This is a song in praise of brotherhood. And it is possible that Mkrtič Péšikt'ašlean at this time was trying not only to inculcate and encourage a sense of belonging to the fatherland, as we saw, but also trying to encourage Armenians not to be divided and not to quarrel with each other. I'm not sure, but given that we know Mkrtič Péšikt'ašlean was a member of the Armenian Catholic community, at about that time there were disputes between Orthodox Apostolic Armenians and Catholic Armenians, so maybe he was saying, look, we are brothers, and brotherhood is the greatest ideal, and give me your hand, we are brothers. We were separated by a storm, by the violent wind, by the ravages of luck, but a single embrace, a single kiss can drive these things away. And there's this refrain, Ent asterok inchka sirun kan zanskali echbaer anon. The construction Ent asterok, which you're going to encounter soon in your ancient Armenian class, by the way, the preposition Ent followed by a word placed in the instrumental. It means below something. So Ent asterok means below the stars. What is more lovely under the stars than the heartfelt word brother? So I had never seen the music for this or heard the melody until I played this YouTube video sent to me by my good friend, the Reverend Dr. George Giragos Leylegian, to whom I'm extremely grateful, of this very fine presentation by Harut Arakelian. And I will try to play you. This was by a group called the Tashjian Brothers. If I remember rightly, they were a father who was a priest and three brothers, the sons. And it's rather poignant that it is the three brothers, the real brothers, who are singing in praise of brotherhood. But this was a poem composed by Mkrtič Péšikt'ašlean in praise of unity of the nation, to try and encourage Armenians not to quarrel amongst each other, but to be united and to work together. Now, I checked before we started this lecture, and I need to find the 16th minute and 24th second of this presentation, but I urge you, if you have an hour and a half available, to listen to the whole presentation. It's fascinating, and the music is marvelous, and there are photographs and all sorts of historical bits of information that Mr. Arakelian has been able to research. But I'll try and find the 16th minute and the 24th second. I hope it will work. 1624. Tashjian Brothers and the Birth of Armenian Recordings. This presentation is called. So let's see, 1624. Okay, let's see if this works. So, this was recorded in 1910 by members of an Armenian family that had emigrated from somewhere or other in historical Armenia, if I remember correctly. I think Harpert may have been mentioned, I'm not sure, you might like to check the presentation. And it was recorded in the United States for Columbia Records in 1910 by the three Péšikt'ašlean brothers. And on the right-hand side, you can see the translation by Alice Stone Blackwell, of whom we spoke and some of whose translations we looked at last semester, you may recall. And so that's actually much better than my improvised translation. They've written Yenk, but it should be Yemk in the original, I believe. We are brothers, or we are brethren. From glorious nature's myriad tongues, those songs be breathed by lips of love, and though the maiden's fingers fair across the thrilling harp strings rove, of all earth's sounds there is no other so lovely as the name of brother. Clasp hands, for we are brothers dear, of old by tempest rent apart. The dark designs of cruel fate shall fail, when heart is joined to heart. What sound beneath the stars aflame so lovely as a brother's name? And when our ancient motherland, the translation is poetic, here and there they depart from the original. Alevor means someone who has white hair, of course, which has been rendered as ancient here, it doesn't matter. And when our ancient motherland beholds her children side by side, the dews of joyful tears shall heal her heart's sad wounds, so deep and wide. What sound beneath the stars aflame, so lovely as a brother's name? We wept together in the past, let us unite in harmony, and blend again our tears, our joys. So shall our efforts fruitful be. What sound beneath the stars aflame, so lovely as a brother's name? Together let us work and strive, together sow with toil and pain, the seed that shall, with harvest blessed, make bright Armenia's fields again. What sound beneath the stars aflame, make bright Armenia's fields again. What sound beneath the stars aflame, so lovely as a brother's name? I should like to acknowledge that this presentation was made and published on YouTube by the Armenian Museum of America, and you can visit this presentation. As I said, it's a wonderful presentation and one that I enjoyed hugely and from which I learned a lot. I did not know who Harut Arakelian was, but I'm planning to email him to indicate my appreciation. And I managed to find the music in one of those Kanar Haigagans, which again were very kindly made available to me by Mihran Minasyan, thanks to the musicologist Haig Utidjian. And here it is. And you can see that even this 1910 version is close to the music by Foschini. It's by Foschini, by Gaetano Ferdinando Foschini, an Italian composer. And it's close to the version that was published in 1862, but again, it has been a little simplified. Here the melody is I pyrzainits Mkrtič Péšikt'ašlean, teerterchin sirohapar, madung kusina menaker, te vorzarnen papukenar. So you see, this is not rendered in the recording. But otherwise, the spirit of it is very interesting. And notice, initially I couldn't even understand the words because they're singing with their regional accent, whether it is from Harpert or wherever the quality of the vowel E and E and so on is rather different. So fascinating for all sorts of reasons, because it shows interactions between an Italian composer and an Armenian Constantinopolitan poet, namely Mkrtič Péšikt'ašlean, who has been our main theme and starting point and inspiration for this afternoon's lecture. We've looked at Kilikia a little bit, and that actually concludes what I wanted to talk about today. So I'd like to ask, are there any questions or reactions?
Yep.
Inga, do you have anything to say or to ask?
No.
We can't see you.
Yeah, it turned off.
Okay, then what I'll do is... Sorry, yes, Marek?
Can I add one thing?
Please do.
Yeah, I find it rather interesting that the brothers were most probably from Harpert, because I've written about this town, and it's true that there were substantial immigration, particularly from this town. So it's nice to know more about the people who emigrated to the United States.
And how they tried to revive and continue and develop their culture and make use of new technology to propagate it. These recordings, they're an excellent treasure trove, and I urge you to click on this link or to write a YouTube search on the Tashtian brothers and the birth of Armenian recordings with Harut Arakelian. And by the way, they were acknowledging the assistance of someone who helped to clean up these recordings from the audio point of view technically, so that we were able to hear them with such clarity and such vividness. So my gratitude goes to the people who exerted those efforts as well. So I am extremely grateful to everyone who helped me prepare these. Anything to do with Bianchini and the Mkrtič congregation, the Library of Congress, Dr. Levon Avdoyan, they were all extremely generous to me. Mr. Mihran Minasian, who made available scans of Kanar Haigagan, which is extremly rare, because it was published as pamphlets. They were very ephemeral, and I believe they survived. They lasted only for a couple of years or so because they lost money. Later on, there was an attempt to revive it. Dendesian tried to do something similar about 17, 18 years later. And also, my gratitude goes very much to the musicologist Haig Utidjian, who has been extremely generous in making available his very valuable expertise as well as rare materials that have enabled me to present the poet Mkrtič Péšikt'ašlean in a way that benefits from the overall context. Oh, and I should also acknowledge my gratitude to Dr. Armenag Yeryayan, who is a very important philologist, even though in his working life he earned his living as a dentist. Interestingly, our greatest translator of the 20th century, arguably, or one of our greatest, was a gentleman called Mkrtič Péšikt'ašlean, who translated all sorts of things from Armenian into English in very fine translations. He too earned his living as a dentist, as a matter of fact. So it is because in the diaspora, there not being any institutions that support this sort of thing, people have been undertaking a lot of personal sacrifices and trying to find time to do these things out of real interest and love, without any grants, without salaries or institutional support. But then we know all that. So, thank you very much indeed, and thank you very much indeed to any YouTube viewers that may see this. I haven't yet made up my mind whether it is sufficiently mature to make it publicly visible. It's very much work in progress, but and of course one is trying to climb on the shoulders of others who have done a lot of work. But I think it's very interesting to put the music and the words together and understand the context that was really international and transcended all sorts of boundaries. And the amazing thing is that this poetry and the music, and especially when we listen to recordings that convey something of the atmosphere and of the spirit. 1910, when this last example was recorded, as was said by Haig Utidjian, there is a poignancy about it because the Adana massacres had just happened, but still Armenians had not lost hope. And the genocide and the destruction, the wholesale destruction of Armenian communities and villages and cities and culture had not yet happened, and at that time people did not know that it was going to happen. But it did happen, and yet we have this marvelous legacy to explore and to try and enjoy it and understand it a little better and see how the words gave rise to the music, how the music inspired the words, how contacts with French culture, for example, and it's not the only one, inspired Armenians, but who did not content themselves by just translating. They also went beyond mere translation. And 2 years ago, when some of you attended my course on the spirituality, music, poetry, and theology arising from Armenian medieval manuscripts, in that course too, I had shown how Armenians during the golden eras of their cultural and spiritual life were able to borrow things from other cultures, whether from the West or from the East, and to put their own peculiar stamp on them, and by grafting these things into their own tradition, to enrich that tradition and renew it. They were not xenophobic, as so many people are today. They were not afraid to adopt something if they liked it. We find that in manuscript illumination, which drew inspiration from the Byzantine tradition, there are even Chinese or Mongolian features, Persian features, Ottoman features. In the case of the music, we have been particularly slow to acknowledge interactions with sister traditions, be they, again, Byzantine, Ottoman, Persian, or whatever. Westernization, of course, which happened in a very big way. And we still need to establish connections in theology. It is no use pretending that Armenian doctrines have remained utterly unaffected over 15 centuries or 16 centuries. And you see all these things happen together. Manuscripts embody theology. They embody music also. That's, of course, a sore point is that we are not able to read the musical notation properly. But still there are hints, and we can do a bit of detective work there. The connections are most striking and most obvious in the case of visual culture, manuscript painting. With music, it's less easy to see the connections. I mean, by its very nature, music is a fleeting art, and unless you have a recording, something that we could not have before the last decade of the 19th century, you may have had, someone in the 12th or 13th century in Cilicia attending a service in a Crusader church who heard something that he liked and he remembered, or vice versa. But these things work during a fleeting moment, because by its very nature, music happens and then it evaporates into the ether and it is no longer there. Even if you've got the notation written, even if we could read it, it's just a blueprint, it's on a piece of paper. Whereas with painting, you can see it, and with writing, you can see it. It's tangible, it's a sort of documentary witness that is there. There are all sorts of reasons. Music also has been much more politicized than manuscript illumination. However, we digress. So, thank you very much indeed, ladies and gentlemen, and it is now exactly 7 o'clock, 7 p.m. here in Prague. So, if I can ask Marek to stop the recording.